everyone. I'm Erica Freudenberger, the Outreach Engagement and Marketing Consultant at SALS, and I'm really excited to continue our work on the next step of your strategic plan. So far, we've discussed an overview of the strategic planning process and how to create a landscape review. Today, we're going to be working on collecting qualitative data, or what we call public knowledge. So far, we reviewed why we're doing community-based planning. To sum it up in a nutshell, we do this because it's a requirement of the New York State Division of Library Development to maintain a charter as a public library. It creates a roadmap to the future for your organization. It incorporates what really matters to people's lives and their aspirations for the future. It establishes how the library defines success and how it will ensure that it's going to meet the goals that have been laid out in the plan. And finally, it communicates to the public how the work the library does benefits the entire community. At the end of the first session, your homework was to form a planning committee and to try out the SWOR exercise. At this point, if you don't already have your planning committee in place, you should at least know who you're going to approach or begin inviting people to participate. During our last session, we talked about creating our landscape review, which incorporates both internal and external data. After that module, you should feel comfortable gathering demographic information about your community, including who lives there and whether it's growing or contracting, library statistics that reflect how your community is using the library, things like circulation, the number of visits you have each year, program attendance, and that kind of thing. Figuring out what key stakeholders are working on, which requires reaching out to other groups in town to see what they're prioritizing as a focus for the next couple of years. And finally, finding out what your municipality's priorities are. And as we talked about it, a really great way to do that is to review your municipality's comprehensive plan, which they are supposed to complete, I think, like every 5 years or so as well. We also discussed the importance of asset mapping, or what we call the community resource plan, to identify the many varied resources in our communities. Your homework included building out your asset map and asking others, and that could be trustees, staff, friends, or volunteers, to contribute to your library's asset map. Please remember that the asset map is a living document, so you'll want to have people continue to contribute to it so it becomes a more robust resource. While we're talking about it in the context of strategic planning today, it's really helpful down the road when you're trying to accomplish all sorts of other things, like planning programs or having successful budget referendums. It's really great to have a list of who's in your community, what they care about, what they support, and what matters to them. So today we're talking about how we create engaged plans, and spoiler alert, community engagement is key. Community engagement promotes the participation of residents in community life, especially those who are excluded and isolated, by engaging them in collective action to create a healthy community. It's a dynamic process with the power to impact multiple systems and create lasting community change. Community engagement is based on the democratic idea that everybody who is affected by an issue that impacts their community should have a say in the decision making to determine its outcome. Put simply, it embraces the community organizing adage, don't make decisions about me without me. It brings people, governments, and organizations together to work collaboratively to recognize the needs and aspirations of our communities so that we can create and realize sustainable visions for our future. So community engagement is both a process and an outcome. We work with community members to achieve long-term sustainable outcomes, which result in sustainable communities. It focuses on decision-making, relationship development, and capacity building. Our approach to community engagement incorporates the philosophy of appreciative inquiry, which assumes the best in people and their organizations. Rather than focus on deficits, it recognizes a world of opportunity, expertise, and talent. When we focus on all that's wrong with a community or an organization and try to come to things from a place of problem solving, it can be really demoralizing. We're starting from a negative space, and it's really hard to get people excited about working together. Appreciative inquiry, on the other hand, recognizes the strengths, possibilities, and successes in each person, organization, or community. We begin by looking at what works, what people are really proud of, and move toward what they can envision. That's a very different, and I would argue, a more inspiring perspective to take. This approach is a people-driven process that requires building relationships with the goal of developing long-term distributed leadership. It values individuals as resources because often when we have money, we feel like we can't accomplish our goals. But when we recognize our own and others' talents and strengths, we can leverage that commitment and creativity to do all sorts of really cool stuff. But we can't do it alone. We know sustainable, flourishing communities require social cohesion. So when I talk about relationships, I mean person to person, not stakeholder or organizational relationships, because organizations, of course, are made up of people. So to develop those relationships, we need to ask questions about what people want to see happen and how they think we can move from where we are to where we want to be. We call this collecting public knowledge, which is different from expert knowledge, and I'll talk more about that in just a minute. But community engagement is relational. It's this idea that by working together, we can reshape the community narrative. It's a collective rather than individual approach to problem solving and community building. It requires long-term, deep, committed relationships, not one-offs to meet a specific need. It means that we have to create space for people to connect, raise concerns, build power, and act in their own interests. And I'm going to admit it can be really challenging to do this work, especially if you, like myself, have control issues. But you have to be willing to let go and create space so that others can shine. And I want to acknowledge that to do so, at least initially, can be really uncomfortable. It means working in a new way, relinquishing power, and inviting new voices into the conversation. When we embrace whole systems thinking, we acknowledge that our actions and decisions have a ripple effect on our community. We cannot make decisions that are only beneficial to us and our organization. By incorporating a range of perspectives, conditions, connections, and capabilities, we often reach dramatically different conclusions than when we sit in our office on our own and write up a plan. So remember, the future of libraries is relational, not transactional. It's not about how many items we share, but about the relationships we build and what can happen because of those networks. In community engagement, when we gather data, we're looking for public knowledge. So what's public knowledge? Public knowledge is what we learn when we talk to people about what matters the most to them, their aspirations, their concerns, and how they see their community. As librarians, when we decide what we're going to do, we often rely on expert knowledge, which comes from our professional analysis. We use statistics, demographics, and other data gleaned from how people use our organizations. When we talk about what we do, it may come across a bit like alphabet soup if we're using expert knowledge. When we talk about staffing the CERC desk, the OPAC, or using the ILS, or any other string of acronyms that make sense to us, but it sounds like a foreign language to our patrons and community. I remember the first time I went to present to the village board, and as I rattled off CERC stats and watched everybody's eyes glaze over. The things that we value and believe give us worth may not be the same things that matter to the public. If we want to root our work in our communities, we need to know what keeps people up at night, what they get excited about, and help them identify ways to make the changes they want to see in the world. To do that, we need to collect public knowledge and report and share it in plain language that everybody understands. When we do, we can identify the issues that matter to people, discover the common purpose that binds us all to be a community, and create a shared narrative that looks to the future. It helps us make choices that are relevant to our communities in a way that everybody understands. There are a couple of different ways to collect public knowledge. You can talk to both individuals and groups. When we talk to individuals, we use the ask exercise. And by the way, both the ask and the aspirations exercise, which I'm going to talk about in a couple minutes, are available for free on the American Library Association's Libraries Transform page. So if you want to find all the tools that I'm talking about, you can go there to check it out. And all of these tools were developed by the Harwood Institute for Public Innovation, and I made some slight modifications to the aspirations exercise, but it's still based on the original tool. So when I was the director of a small library, one of the people on my planning committee was my deputy mayor. Based on his experience as a political candidate, he suggested that we go door to door in the village asking people these 4 simple questions, which we did. And again, the ask exercise is meant to be used with individuals. So as you look at these 4 questions, you may notice that we don't ask anything specific about the library. And that is a very deliberate decision. In my experience, when you ask people what they want from the library, you'll hear that they want more of what already exists, because they may not know what a 21st century library does or is capable of. But we have to remember that we're only ever going to be as successful as our communities, so we need to ensure that we're doing everything in our power to create strong, resilient, and sustainable communities. I want to give one word of warning. The ask exercise is designed to take about 5 to 10 minutes per interview, and sometimes it does. Like when we use this at festivals or in the grocery store, we stuck to that time. But if you do what we did and you go door to door, people tend to invite you in where they're comfortable, and you ask them about what they think about these things, and these are big questions. Be prepared to spend a bit longer hearing the answer. It's definitely worth it, but I want to give you a heads up that it does take a lot of time. In the end, we talked to more than 250 people and about a dozen stakeholder organizations during the course of our planning process, figuring out how best to serve our village of 1,961 people. So when you use these questions with people, remember to ask follow-up questions to figure out what it is people really mean. If someone says they want to live in a safe community, ask what that looks like to them. Get as many specifics as you can, because we really don't want to guess or assume that we understand what people are talking about. The second tool I'm going to talk about is the aspirations exercise. This is used with groups of people who currently work together, who will continue to work together. So when I talk about this, I'm talking about groups like the Rotary, the Chamber of Commerce, the school board, the town board, those kind of groups that are, that are in place, that are working towards common goals, and that work together for a long period of time. To do the aspirations exercise, you want to allow for like 45 minutes to an hour. It's really a great thing for when you're starting out, before you go out to use this with the public. Try it out with your board or with your library staff. That way it allows them to participate in the work and to build support for your community engagement efforts. Because let's face it, if you just tell your board, I'm going to be spending the next 6 months out of the library, they're going to think you've lost your mind. So if you can demonstrate what you're doing and explain why and how the process works, you're going to have a much better chance of getting buy-in. I practiced this tool with my board before I went out to the public. It allowed them to get a feel for what we were going to be doing, and it gave them a chance to ask a lot of questions before we unrolled it to the public. This is really important because the last thing you ever want to do is surprise your board or have them hear about what you're doing from somebody else. So please take the time to get everybody to experience the tools and hopefully recruit more people to participate, including your board, to play an active role in collecting public knowledge. So the tools we're using today are meant to be used as part of in-person discussions, and these discussions ideally would not take place at the library. They would take place at other places throughout town. Although I would say right now, given that we're in these like constant waves of a pandemic, feel free to adapt and conduct these conversations virtually. If you have to do it over the phone or use Zoom or something like that, um, whatever feels great and protects community health, I would say that. I do want to give one caveat. I know that libraries have posted these questions to their websites as a survey to have people respond to, and I am requesting that you do not do that. You are not going to get useful information, and that is not how you do this work. These are really powerful tools to help you turn outward toward the community, putting their aspirations at the heart of what you do. But you have to talk to people to do it. This is really high-touch work, and there are no shortcuts. So I bet you're thinking, I can barely get done what I need to do. Never mind chase people down to ask them their aspirations. I hear you. This work is not easy and it requires building capacity. When I first began doing this work, I realized that we had a ton of work ahead of us, which we would not be able to do on our own. I was the first full-time director my library had ever had, and I had a staff of 6 part-time people. And there was no way we could make this work. So we asked for help, and we had volunteers from the community and local college students offered to partner with our team and go door to door. The more conversations we had, the more people wanted to get involved, which was really fantastic, but it also meant relinquishing control, which for me can be very, very difficult. But to help our community move forward, we had to build relationships and ask people to be part of a larger conversation. Our role was to facilitate and to convene these conversations. If it's possible, and I realize that it may not be, it's best to have a team of 3 to work together. And I recognize that if you're from a small library, that may mean your entire staff. So don't worry, you don't need to have 3 people to do this. Ideally, you'll have a facilitator, a scribe, and an observer. The facilitator's role is to make people comfortable, to set the ground rules for the discussion, and explain why the library is doing this work. The facilitator then shares the questions that are going to be asked during the conversation, and you will find the handout to use attached to this module in our e-learning platform with all of the participants, and lets people have a couple minutes to reflect on them and write down their thoughts. So I want to be really clear. This is not a pop quiz. We're not trying to surprise anyone with these questions. So if you schedule an aspirations exercise with the community group, please feel free to send them the questions ahead of time so they have a chance to think about it. These are really big questions for people to wrangle with, and it's perfectly okay to give them time ahead of time to consider what their responses are. So once everybody's had a couple minutes to review the questions, the facilitator leads a conversation by using the questions as prompts and asking follow-up questions to untangle what people really mean. The facilitator also has to keep an eye on the time. Since we're asking people to give us their time, we have to be respectful and honor our commitment to keeping to the established schedule. So in my experience, some groups get really excited once the conversation starts and they want to have an extended conversation. That's fantastic. And if you can, feel free to extend the time, but be sure to check in with everyone, acknowledge where you are regarding the time, and ask if they're okay with continuing the conversation. But I would also set like a hard out, like say you've been going for an hour, ask people if they're willing to stay for another 15 minutes. You don't want to have it go on just endlessly because then people will burn out. So you can extend it to continue the conversation, but have some sense of boundaries, I guess I would say. So the facilitator also has to help participants identify and simplify what specific words or phrases will succinctly and accurately sum up each posed question. By the end of the session, you have a community narrative that will resonate with all participants. And I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. So the role of the scribe is to use active listening to capture what people are saying. So this role requires excellent listening skills and also being very precise about capturing the language that participants are using. And this, I just want to say, this can be more challenging than you think. I know I often edit things automatically in my head into the language that I normally use, which may not be how somebody else has phrased it. So the scribe wants to be really scrupulous about using participants' language so we have an accurate record of what was said, and we want to be able to use that very same language when we report back to our community. And finally, there's the role of the observer. If you're lucky enough to have a third person, it's really terrific to have someone attend to see who's there, watch what's happening, and take notes on the room's interactions and vibe. They can watch for body language and other relationship prompts to provide additional insight into the debrief that happens afterward with all three members, with the facilitator, the scribe, and the observer. Again, if you don't have the third person, don't worry. For me, it was a luxury and it was helpful when we did have it, but you don't need one. You definitely do need to have at least two people though, because you don't want the facilitator to also be taking the notes. That's too much. You can't do both well and really give them the time they need. So be sure you have at least two people for each time. So as we move through the conversation, we're working toward the end goal of creating a succinct narrative to sum up what we've discussed. By the end of the aspirations exercise, you should have a completed community narrative that looks something like this. The best way to ensure that you're able to get to this by the end of your time is to take a moment to reflect after people have answered each question. So for instance, if our first question has been about what are your aspirations for your community, at the end of that discussion period, I ask, thinking about our aspirations, how can we sum up what we've discussed in a word or a phrase? By doing that work after each question, the scribe can plug in the relevant words as you move along. So at the end, you can read back the completed narrative to the group to ensure that it still holds up. That way, if they want to make adjustments or refine their thinking, they have time to do that. You want to keep track of all the responses and narratives as you visit various community groups. And in our next session, we're going to talk about what happens at the end of the data collection when we review the narratives and see what common themes emerge before reaching a larger narrative for the whole community. So I know I've covered a lot of information. So if you have any questions, please get in touch. I'm really happy to talk through any sticking points or explain things in more detail if that's helpful. If you'd like me to facilitate an aspirations exercise for a group in your community, I'm happy to do so, although I do want to make it clear that at this point I'm only working remotely, so I would be using Zoom for the conversation. In our next session, we're going to be talking about how we analyze the data that we've collected and how to identify emerging themes. So thank you so much for making time to do this process. If you have any questions, please reach out to me, and I hope that you're having some fun. Take care, and we'll see you in the next session.